Well, welcome tonight. This is going to be our leadership training, and it's become pretty clear it's helpful to get together with folks from different teams and committees and give ourselves a sense of what's going on in our church, where we're going. And so tonight, you're going to have a chance to engage with each other a little bit. We're going to talk about our goals for next year that Church Council has been working on. We're going to have Linda present the budget so you understand how the budget works in your different areas. So I want to start by telling a story. I've been sharing this with churches as we talk about who we are as Methodists. Some of you guys have heard it once before. There's a story that goes about two farmers, an old man named Joe and his farmer friend across the way, and they had grown up on the farms together. So the farmers both had grown up on their properties. They had lived there a long time. They had raised their families on their property. And they've been good friends for most of that time. But it goes that at this point in their life, Joe's neighbor had supposedly stolen one of his cattle and brought it over to his place, and it was a calf. And Joe was pretty mad about this calf being stolen, supposedly, even though we're not sure if it was his or his neighbor's. And so they were starting to get into this fight, and they kept fighting. And then one night, they all both went to bed, and his neighbor must have snuck outside and went up to the upper pond and dug a trench from the upper pond down between the two houses. And so when Joe woke up in the morning, he looked out, and there was a little stream dividing their two properties. Well, Joe wasn't too happy about that. And about that time, a wanderer came along. And he wandered up to the place where Joe lived, and he said, "I'm a carpenter, I do trades as I wander through the different countryside. Do you have something you could pay me to do?" And Joe said, so sick of my neighbor. I have a bunch of wood out by the barn over here. Let me show you where it is. Build a fence for me between me and my neighbor. And so Joe showed him where all the stuff was, and then he had to go to town to do some work, get some things for the house. And when Joe came back, he looked and he came up to the carpenter and he said, "What have you done?" And about that time, Joe's neighbor was walking across the bridge that the carpenter had built. And he said, "Joe, you're a bigger man than I ever would have been." And they both wanted the man to stay. They were so excited, but the carpenter said, "No, I travel the countryside and I offer service to the people around me, and so I'm going to go on my way." I share that story because I think as Methodists we're bridge builders, and as Christians we're bridge builders. That's what we're about. But we might find ourselves as leaders sometimes being Joe or his old farmer friend, struggling with one another, or we might find ourselves at times being the bridge builder to help people work together and do our work together. So to start our time tonight, I'm going to invite us to watch a TED Talk, actually, by Simon Sinek. He's a management consultant who goes around the world doing this. And it talks about the why. Why do we do what we do is actually more important than what we do here at the church. So I'm going to invite us to sit back and watch this. So, we're here for the why, and that's what leaders need to know most of all. And every time you come to a meeting, that's what we need to be talking about, is the why, and why we're here. And we believe the message of Jesus Christ has the power to transform lives. That's very much who we are as a people of God. And so we're going to talk about leadership tonight, but it's about how you do your meetings. It's about how you engage in the work you do. And it also is going to tie into who we are as Shiloh. And so I'm going to start with just, whenever we think of meetings, we always think they need to be very business oriented and get through them, and that's important. Don't do long meetings, I will say that now. Plan meetings to last less time than you actually have, and your life will be much better. One of the things I want to encourage us to do when we have meetings is always keep God at the center. So if you're leading a meeting, I encourage leaders to bring a prayerful reflection with them. If you do a daily devotional, bring that with you to your meeting. Have a conversation with folks when they get there about where God's showing up in their lives. You don't have to take 15, 20 minutes. I know some conference leaders that do that, and it drives me nuts. But take 5 to 10 minutes just to slow down everybody, because we're always chatting when we get there anyway. What if that had a little more to it? Take turns with folks. Don't always, as a leader, be the one who brings it. Invite people ahead of time, because I've watched when I've invited folks to prayer on the spot, they end up making me do it. And so make sure you think about it ahead of time. Talk to folks about it. And remember too, when you're having those dialogues, some of us come with pretty heavy stuff to those meetings. So if we're cranky, there's probably a reason why. If we're super happy, we've probably already told you. But just remember that when a leader shows up, they're dealing with stuff too. So as you deal with dynamics, keep that aware. Don't be afraid to support each other as Christian disciples either. So if someone really is struggling, don't be afraid to engage with them outside of the meeting. Don't be afraid to talk to them if they need support or prayer. And in fact, I would encourage that, and I've seen a lot of our leaders do that here at Shiloh, and I think it's really important. Pray at the beginning and end of your meetings. And we've started to get in the habit of that. We're still working on it. It doesn't have to be a long prayer, and seriously, if you have a really long meeting and somebody says amen at the end, everyone knows it's over. So make sure you just take that time to bring that reflection. And also, you may want to choose a ritual for your group. I'll teach you guys about the love feast tonight that I do with the youth group. Maybe there's a Lord's Prayer version you want to say at the end of your group. Maybe you just want to say the Lord's Prayer at the end. But as a leader, you can help choose that for your group. So you'll hear me talk about one of the tools I'm using quite a bit with our leadership is this book called Small Church Essentials. And it talks a lot about the why of small church and how important it is to be flexible and nimble. I've given copies to our lay leaders, both Dennis and Dave. If you want a copy ever, let me know. I'm happy to use my expense account to buy you a copy because I think it's that important. But one of the things that the author talks about in there a lot about the why is that churches really need to grasp who they are and who's initiating stuff in their community. And the author, Carl Vaders, uses this example, and this is what's going to get into your handouts there. So the three circles on the screen are God, church, and your pastor. So these are the interrelations that happen in a small church. So just an awareness, Carl Vaders talks about this reality. We all have whys in our lives, why we do things. God has a why, so God is a part of that relationship for the community. The church has a why. We all as a community gathered have a why of why we're here, and there's things that we believe we should be doing. And I as a pastor come with some of those things too. What Carl Vaders talks about is number 2 area is a great place in the church to have happen. Pastor and God have a conversation, and I engage in the ministry of some kind. You as individuals do that too, just an awareness. The church and God can, in that 3 zone, come up with some incredible ministries, things like that. That 1 zone is the sweet spot, when we're all working together on something and we just feel like we know why we're here and what we're doing. The 4 on that is a danger zone, is what Carl Vaders talks about. So the 4 could be, this is my favorite example, I love technology, right? Like I could do technology all day, and the church, it needs technology to connect to people. We could spend the whole area of 4 in technology alone. Another area for 4, an example would be pastors often come into congregations and there's a real need for pastoral care and no one else is doing it in the church. No one else at all. Our church has a great way of doing that with visitation and stuff, but no one's doing it. And so the church and the pastor end up getting in a situation where that's all the pastor is doing. The pastor is not providing any leadership or anything. And so that can be a 4 area too. Those are examples. So the playbook in front of you is a way for us to look at those zones of 3, 2, and 1. And I'll have a sheet I share with you in a little bit more about the 2 zone. But we want you to have this as you do your work in your committees so that you know what the goals are that Church Council looked at last year and set for us in 2019, but also the why of who we are. And so I want to take a second on that sheet of paper. You'll see on the second page of the Shiloh Playbook our aspirational values. So in about 3 months of me getting here with Church Council, I worked really hard and had us have a conversation about how do we treat each other as leaders. And we'll keep revisiting this every couple of years because it's important that we interact with each other well and that we have a sense of shared values amongst each of us. And so we're going to take a few minutes to look at these for right now. But we're going to do that. The other sheet I gave you was a sheet of the how we treat one another's from the Bible. And I'm going to have Steve start with the first one on that sheet. And we're going to go around and read all those to each other. So Steve, if you'd start with the first one.
Be at peace, excuse me, be at peace with one another.
Buddy, if you would take the next one.
Love one another.
Be devoted to one another.
Honor one another. Live in harmony with one another.
Stop passing judgment on one another. Accept one another.
Instruct one another.
Greet one another.
Serve one another.
Carry each other's burdens. Be patient, bearing with one another in love.
Be kind and compassionate to one another.
Forgive each other.
Speak to one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs.
Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ.
In humility, consider others better than yourselves.
Teach one another.
Admonish one another.
We'll talk about that one in a second.
Encourage each other.
Steve will keep going.
Build each other up. Spur one another on. Spur one another on towards love and good deeds.
Do not slander one another.
Don't grumble against each other.
Confess your sins to each other.
Pray for one another. Clothe yourselves with humility toward one another.
So I love these. I actually just ran across these at a training I was doing earlier this week with a bunch of youth. And we asked them, what does admonish one another mean? And they all looked at us like, I don't know, what does it mean? And somebody had to look it up on Google, actually, I have to be honest. So I think these are great when we're talking about how we treat one another as leaders. So here's what I'm going to have you do. I'd like you to pair off is what I want you to do. I want you to look at our aspirational values in the playbook that I just talked about. And I'm going to give each of the pairs a sticky note, and I want you guys to come up with 2 other things you would add to the list if you were to add something you feel like is missing from those aspirational values. So this is a handout about what I'm going to be working on as a pastor this year. You don't need to look at it now. I invite you to take it with you. But now I want to just kind of go through the structure of our committees in our church and talk about how they interact so that we're all kind of aware. What I'm constantly aware of is either people haven't been in leadership before or less and less people grew up in the Methodist system, so they really don't know what committee does what. And so I like to take some time to kind of just give you a sense of how these interact with each other. So I, as the pastor, am the spiritual leader of the congregation. I'm appointed to serve the people of Billings alongside you all as Shiloh. That's my role, according to our wonderful book of discipline, which I left in my office on purpose. So, in the current times, right now, that means I'm called to offer you tools to help you lead spiritually. I help lead the staff that you all choose to hire here. I provide you with best practices on how to be a community of faith growing to share the good news of Jesus Christ in the larger community. And my job is to empower you as disciples to do that work. So I consistently look at how I can do that. It's what I'm constantly looking for in my prayer life, in my professional life, is to make sure I'm finding tools for you all. The Charge Conference. So the Charge Conference is something that happens usually once a year, but it can happen more often than that. It's when we call all of the members of the church together, and we vote on the things that have to be voted on. So my salary, you guys get to see it every year and vote on that. It's always fun for me to show my salary to everybody. We also get to vote on our directions for the church too. So who are we, what we're about. There's certain decisions that have to be made at Charge Conference. And so that's that yearly gathering that really sets the course for who we are as a church. The church council, we call it ad council here too, but in the discipline it's the church council, and we've been using both terms. Provides for planning, implementing of programs of nurture, outreach, witness, and resource in the local church. It also provides for the administration of the organization and temporal life. These are big words. Let me explain what that means. This means that the church council takes the vision for the church, they help implement it, they help make sure the committees connect to one another, they help make decisions that might be more substantial for the church, and they help to bring us together to have that sense of community and connection consistently. It's a huge role. So all of you who are committee chairs technically our team chairs have a position there. We would like to have you whenever you can be at those meetings. But it's always good to make sure your committee or team has representation there pretty often. And so it's good to check in with your group because that's where the bigger decisions are made. That's where news is shared. And we're trying to do a better job of sharing communication from those meetings. But it's a lot better when we have more people at those meetings.
Well, the truth is, if your committee chairs don't show up, all you have is the lay leader and the lay member talking to you.
Exactly. That's exactly what it looks like. Staff Parish Relations Committee, you'll hear us use the term SPRC really fast after a while and people get really confused. That's the committee that does the relationship between the pastor and the congregation and also staff. They help manage the connection with the staff. They help us look at policies for staff. And it is the only committee by discipline that's a confidential committee. So they're the ones who can have closed meetings, just of the membership. And that really is about confidentiality for staff, for the pastor. In times of transition for a congregation with the pastor, they're the ones who walk through with the district superintendent to do that work. Trustees are subject to the direction of the Charge Conference. The Board of Trustees have the supervision, oversight, and care of all the real property owned by the local church and all the property and equipment acquired directly by the local church or by any society, board, class. There's a lot of things churches can do. Commission or similar organization within the church. So, trustees, you're the legal entity of the church in a lot of ways. So you're actually ones who deal with legal things if they come up. But you also have to deal with all the property. And making sure it's available for ministry and that kind of thing. So we'll talk about the trustees a little bit when we talk about goals too. They accomplished all their property goals last year, so that's something cool to talk about. But the trustees do a lot of important work. The trustees is one of those committees like SPRC that has to be members of the church mostly. You can often have somebody who's not a member of the church if they're there for a specific reason, but the rest of them have to be members of the church. So. Yeah, Judy.
Would the trustees handle insurance on church-owned property?
Correct. Yeah. So they review the insurance policies that come due and determine what they need. And we have stricter guidelines from the conference now around what we have to have for insurance as well. Finance is the group that's responsible for stewardship and financial resources. They're the ones who manage the budget. They're also the ones who look at fundraising for the community and how that fundraising happens. They approve expenditures from the budget. They look at throughout the year if we're making income, if the adjustments to a budget need to be made, and they're the body responsible for that. And then there's all the other teams and committees, and you, after this meeting, everyone who was on that invite list will get an email with everything, including the roster for committees, that kind of thing, so you'll know who the other committees are. But pastors or any standing team or committee can form another team to do work, but they're responsible back to your team. I just want to remind folks of that. So your team still has final approval. So trustees could form a team of folks to work on a project, but ultimately the trustees has to make the approval of funds and things like that for that work. This is the chance for me to also encourage you all that if there's a time where any of these committees are doing joint work and there's a specific project, that you can form like subgroups together and get a couple members from other teams and committees to do that work. Or, this is the other encouragement, if you've got a project and you don't have the expertise you need in your group, don't hesitate to form another group and pull in some new leaders to be a part of that process. That's how we actually get new leadership, is when we get folks engaged that way. And so just really encourage you to think through that. All right. Any questions about the structure? Okay, if they come up later, bring them up. Staff and I talked at our staff meeting on Wednesday. One of the challenges we're struggling with is communication back from the committees. We really, minutes is a way to do that. We get those, but we don't always get all the detail we need. So we are going to be developing a worksheet that every team and committee will have access to. We'd like you to fill that out during your meeting and turn it into the office. And on that worksheet, you're going to have things down there that the pastor needs to know, that the treasurer needs to know, that your church administrator needs to know. And those will be outlined on there, but things we need to be aware of. If there's expenditures, Linda needs to know that this has been approved, that kind of thing. Also on there is going to be a place to understand where you can advertise things so that you're aware when you're doing different programs, how you can think about the advertising and where you can put it. If you don't know, we have an email that goes out every week. We have a bulletin, we have a newsletter, we have Facebook. There's a lot of different ways to advertise an event now. And we want to make sure that we're starting to think through using all of those mediums, including sometimes we're even advertising events like in the local newspaper just through the calendar, so no cost even, but like Aging Well, putting it in the paper is a really smart idea. It might be good to do that for some of our other things too. And finally, one of the challenges we're also running into is scheduling. Oftentimes folks will do a committee meeting and forget to tell us, and then we have two people in the room at the same time. So part of it is just making sure we have dates for scheduling and we get those in the calendar as well. That will come out in that follow-up email too.
I have another question is, I have not a clue. I've been here 4 years or so. I have no clue as to who is on the staff parish relations, who's on the church council, who's on the trustees.
So that follow-up email is going to have that sheet with it.
Oh, it will? Because
Yep.
I don't know.
Yeah, so it's already on the website too. We have it there. So if you go to the Serve Shiloh part of the website, it has that there.
Has that down?
But we'll have copies, and there's always a copy in the office too, Judy. So I keep an updated copy on the bulletin board above the copier as well.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Scheduling, so
Yes.
if you schedule something like, in the middle of the month, is the calendar constantly updated?
Yes.
Okay, so it doesn't just come out once.
No, no. So we have a Google Calendar now that's on the website, and it's also linked in every weekly email as well. And the idea there is that it's constantly updated. It helps us manage the spaces too. So we know if a space is busy or not when we're looking at it. So.
And then we have to check it.
And then Liz has to check it.
I didn't do that today.
All right, I'm gonna have us actually take about. Well, I asked Linda tonight if she would do a little presentation on how our budget works, and especially give us a chance to kind of have access to it so that the folks that are here could see it. Like I said, also, when we send out the follow-up thing, I'll make sure we include the budget as well so folks can see and have that. But it's important for you as leaders to know, mostly because we're all responsible for the budget. It's not like Linda's the only one who's looking at this. We all need to be paying attention to it throughout the year. We all need to be aware of how our expenses are going. If we're starting to see some financial struggle, we have to make course corrections so that we're not overspending, things like that. So we want you all just to be aware. We want you to be conscious about how you spend. And so I'm going to turn it over to Linda. And she's got a presentation here. There we go. All right.
Yeah, so Tyler asked me to do the budget, maybe the budget building process and kind of how monthly reports are relate to the budget. And this is kind of a general presentation, so if you have any questions about your committee or on this presentation or on any reports that come out any month, just ask me. I'm usually here on Mondays, but you can call me at home and I'd be glad to visit with you about it. Like I said, I won't get into specific committees for this one. But this is our budget. Whoops. Wait, there. This is our budget, and that's your first page, and that column is actually the 2019 budget. Well, I should say too, this is a line item budget, so those are the only things that we pay out of the general money that comes into the church. So first column, the budget. Second column, percent of total budget. This was last year's budget, just so you can see the difference between the two. If you look at the bottom, that's our total for this year. It's $208,000. You'll look at the total for last year, $231,000. So we had the task of cutting $23,000 this year. And I'll explain later how we came to those figures, that we had to get it down to 208. You'll also see on this budget, the last column where the differences are, we cut in primarily 3 different spots. The annual conference. Last year, annual conference was in Ogden, Utah, so we had to budget for the pastor and the lay member and their expenses to get to Ogden. This year it's in Billings, so we're going to be paying registration fees. So that was a big number.
So Dennis and I don't get to rent the suite?
Not on us. You can do it on yourself. Another big place that we cut was the capital replacement fund. This is a fund that we started probably, I don't know, Judy, can you help me? Maybe 15 years ago. And it was just to take a part of the money that comes in every single month and put it into reserve for when we have a door that needs to be replaced, or a furnace, or a hot water heater, or the flooring in the fellowship hall this year, lighting. And the purpose for that was mostly because we didn't want to always be asking people for money. We didn't want to, always have to be fundraising in order to repair something.
Can I give an example? At most churches, like if a boiler goes out or a furnace, it's a complete ask of the congregation every time.
Right.
And so this is a really healthy way to say, we're going to save just enough to be able to do those things so that every time something goes down, we're not making that additional ask of the church.
Well, you know it's gonna happen.
Right, exactly.
Right, and actually when we had, Ken Penny did this for us, and he just did the life cycle of everything, carpet and everything that we have that needs to be replaced, and we kind of came up with a number, and it was, I can't remember now what it was, and that number's gone up and down. Unfortunately, that's a number that we can cut if we need to, and this year we did have to do that. You'll see in this first column, it's at 0 this year, so they are getting no money to replenish, but they do have some money in savings, so it's not like they won't have anything. And then the third place that primarily was cut was staff, and you'll see that on the bottom of that that 5th column. So the budget is made up of different sections. The first section is operations, and that's just kind of what we need to, it's boring stuff that needs to be done. It's like postage and advertising and annual conference. And that makes up 4.15% of the budget. Mission shares, I guess that's kind of faint there, is 13%. That was restructured this year after we went to the Mountain Sky Conference, 13% of our income. So potentially, if we get the 208,000 in, it will have gone up actually a little bit from last year. If we don't get 208,000 in, it'll be 13% of whatever we take in.
So it's not membership time?
Nope.
At this point?
It's 13 income based.
Okay.
Totally.
Rocky Mountain's been doing that for a while before we merged, and it has been very helpful to churches that are struggling, so that they're not penalized that year. And we've seen they've been increased in mission shares because they went to an income base.
13% is an interesting.
That's just how
Sounds
you make,
like a
that's how you make the
compromise.
budget. It's how you make the budget is what I'm
Yeah.
saying.
So it's what?
It's how you make the budget. It's 13%. But the budget that they.
Do you know if that's gone up and down in Rocky
They've
Mountain?
kept it level, and actually the goal, I will share this being on the committee that's working on it, the goal is, we're trying to get it down. We would like to see that come down to 10%, but that means everybody's gotta give at the rate they should be.
Yeah, it actually ends up being a fair amount more than what we were doing before.
So,
Oh, really?
Yes.
So based on, when it was based on membership, then this is actually.
Well, for the last several years, it's been, membership was one factor, but it was also our budget and our expenses, our programming. So it was a convoluted formula.
Sure, okay.
And membership was just a part of that.
So now it's just 13% all the time.
13% of your income versus any of the other stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, what other stuff is there?
Well, capital income isn't counted in that. There's certain things that don't get counted
Right.
in the income process.
If we were still paying a mortgage, we wouldn't have to do that.
Right.
Or if we had a capital campaign to, you know, build a second story or something.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
Yes, or say an elevator.
Yeah,
and, yeah. So the next section is property. That's what the Board of Trustees is responsible for, and that makes up 12.79% of the budget. Believe it or not, we have property taxes. They're not actually taxes, they're fees. Those are the fees we pay. We do not pay taxes of $5,200. Our insurance is $7,300 a year. The next section is committees. That's a total of 3.68%. And we do have some committees still listed on our budget that are not funded, including children's ministries, youth ministries, because they are currently funded through Noisy Offering. So we can get to that later, but they have a very healthy income through Noisy Offering, healthier than what we have ever given them when we didn't do Noisy. And the other one is Community Garden, and it's a self-funded committee right now too. And then the final amount, just like any business, personnel is usually your highest cost. It's 66.33% of the budget. So you do have this sheet of the total budget and the different sections that it's broken down into. So budget building, how do we do that? Believe it or not, the first week in July, it starts for the next year. And at that time, we gather the information for your committee or your line item for the last 6 months and the last 12 months. We get that information to you by the third week of July. And then in August, finance starts talking. And I mentioned earlier that we decreased by $23,000, and that's when we start looking at what our bottom line needs to be. We do it in August, and we do it by anticipating, and I want to tell you what we got so we do a projection, and our first projection in July was our income was going to be between $189,000 and $194,000 on a $231,000 budget. It ended up being $193,000. So we've gotten pretty good at being able to project what it's going to be. And that's in August after 7 months of income.
What goes into those projections?
We do a straight extrapolation. We do one adding pledges that we know are annual pledges that maybe we got in the first 7 months. We take those out, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4 different ways that we look at it. So you don't have this page. If you want it, I can get it to you.
No, I'm just
We
curious.
prorate the annual gifts. If somebody gave an annual gift in January, we prorate it back through, and that's
Educated guessing.
and a lot of it's educated guessing. Yeah. Yeah.
And you'll talk about later, but you have the history too of giving for the past
Right,
6 years and
right.
8 years.
Mhm.
And that's
Yeah,
helpful.
page 4 on
That's
your
helpful
on
for
that
process.
monthly report is the history. So in August, what I do then is I send a letter to all the committee chairs. I ask you to meet with your committee and give us your best guess at what you need to operate your committee the next year. And we don't want you to hold back, because there are some years where we can give you everything you ask for. Or, you know, through discussion, we may decide that this year is the year that this committee needs, you know, to be fully funded what you have requested. So then when we meet in September, we add all your requests in, and we see how that differs from the bottom line that we had set the month before, after we've also looked at now 8 months of data. And this year it looked like we were going to have to cut. And as it turns out, we cut 23,000, but we're still almost 15,000 over what came in last year. So we still took a little step out in faith, I guess you could say, hoping that, this year will turn out okay. And one reason we're able to do that is because for the last several years, we have had enough income that we have built a reserve. And we knew that this year going in. We knew we probably wouldn't make our budget, but we thought, let's try it. Let's add some money to some of the programs. Maybe they can do outreach, and it didn't work. So this year we stepped it down a bit, but we're still hopeful that outreach will increase our people coming to church and our giving for the year. So next year we'll have to decide what we're going to do. But I'll get to later what our reserve is and what how comfortable we are with spending it. October, we present to Ad Council then what Finance recommends as the budget. And in November, it's presented at church conference for a vote. So are there any other questions about budget building? I mean, no way, aren't you, Steve?
Well, I can't read it anyways.
I know. That's true. Do you want me to tilt it
No,
to you guys for a while?
That's fine. That's fine. We'll get to the important stuff sometime.
Yes, yeah. So the monthly reporting. I'm going to start with page 3, if you guys want to turn to page 3. And it should look very familiar because it should look just like the budget did. All the line items are listed here, very same line items. The first 2 columns are exactly the same. So this is December's report. So it has the 2018 budget and the percent of budget. So yeah, those 3 columns should look just like your budget did. There's your budget. The next column is the income to date for those line items, and there's not a whole lot. Adult Ministries always has some through their, if you take a Bible study and you pay for your book, then it's put back into that fund. Adult Sunday School collects money, it goes back into that line item. And the only other thing last year that had money was fellowship off their harvest dinner and maybe your brunch or something. The next column is the expenses for the month, the previous month, and this just happens to be December. The next column are expenses year to date, and the budget you have remaining. So that's just the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 column subtracted from the second column, and the percent of your budget remaining. Not everything can easily be divided into 12 months and by 12, but if you do have something that is, if you see, if it's February and you've used 75% of your budget, you need to start looking at something. So that's just a different way to report it. So any questions on page 3 then? So that is strictly just follows the budget and the money that's used for that. So if we go back to page 1 then, I know that's kind of crazy, but I just thought it'd be easier that way. Page 1 of the monthly treasurer's report is the income and expense and income to budget report. And so the top section is income to expense. The top line is the only line that applies to the budget. The other lines are for missions and dedicated gifts. So for instance, in December, the missions line had 1,056 come in. Most of that was Relay for Life. Some of that was, I can't think of what else maybe, but there's things that come in every month that are meant to be for missions, and so they cannot be used to pay the electric bill or Tyler's salary or anything else. So the top line on this page 1 is really the only one that is associated with the budget.
The missions offering is like the sleeping bags?
Yeah.
Does that go into this figure?
It would have gone into that and set aside, yeah. So you've got a total amount for December, which is the bottom of that first column on the top section. But again, the only amount that is available for the budget is the top one. And our budget is now called Ministries and Missions. The church calls it the general fund, and I probably have said general fund about 15 times already because that's what I'm used to. But we do call it Ministry and Missions budget. Same with expenses. The top line is the one you have, even though we have a total of expenses. But this is the second batch of numbers is the year-to-date. Because I don't know for sure in my head the numbers. So those numbers again on page 1 come from page 3. On those columns you have your monthly expenses and your year-to-date expenses. They're the same as the red circled on page 1. So that's where those numbers come from. And then this part of the top box is just last year's, so for a little comparison. And then this is income to budget. This one's probably not as important, but we do watch that as a finance committee just to make sure that we're not too off balance with it. There's often things in our budget that we know probably won't use the entire budget. So we still watch that part of it. There again, it's just I just take our budget and divide by 12. Last year, our monthly amount was $19,250. If we would have had that income every month, we would have been even. And for the year, it would have been $231. And then that number just comes down and gives you the difference between the amount received and the monthly budget. You'll see that number at the end is a lot. Oops, it didn't do it, but it's a lot larger than. So that deficit was $37,000, as opposed to the $14,000 up above that was income to expenses. So page 2 on your report then is just balances. So that's the month-end balances. The first one's just the checking account. It carries a pretty high balance if payroll comes before the next Sunday, and it did in January. The next section is a certificate of deposit, which was a memorial fund that was set up for camp scholarships and education several years ago, and we'd actually used it for one thing this year. The next one is a capital replacement fund, and that was a dedicated gift given a few years ago for the trustees to use for, carpet replacement or whatever. The next one is operating reserve. So Norma, there's part of your operating reserve. And that came from just having extra income to expenses. And this one was a dedicated gift given a few years ago also. So you have this CD, and then if you look at the savings account, which isn't next on my PowerPoint, but the general savings undesignated, that's how much, if you add those figures up, that's what our reserve is. So that equals 103 plus 54 is 156, so about 200.
And how many months is that?
Well, our budget next year is 208, so almost 12 months. And we came to that figure. What was the committee called, Pam? You were on the committee that.
The fact team.
Yes, the fact team.
Yeah, and it was a group of people from Yellowstone Conference that really encouraged churches to have a reserve. And there was one time, there have been times since I've been treasurer that we haven't had enough money. And it isn't any fun to have to call Northwest Energy, or not Northwest, because we don't have them, but Montana Power and say, please, could we just, could you wait until next week to get the bill, even though it's due this week? And we've actually had to do that. So it was important to us and our leaders to actually get a reserve. And so they recommended 9 to 12 months, I believe. So we lost 14,000 of it this year. That's why we were comfortable going 15,000 over what our income was last year. After that, we'll probably look more seriously at more cuts. So the next line is endowment. We do have an endowment, and it's at the point now where we can start granting small amounts. I think there's maybe 2,000 in there that we can grant, and we're going to do that here real soon. And then the next section is savings account. We have one savings account with several sub-accounts. And what I did is I enlarged it for us because it's pretty, it was pretty small. So our savings account is made of, just like the budget, several different things, but there's escrow accounts. Like I said, our property taxes are $6,300 a year. Our property insurance last year was $7,200, and if I had to pay that in 1 month, I couldn't do that. And they're actually both due this in May, so I really couldn't do that. So I just work it like a mortgage company does and take out a 12th of the anticipated bill every month. So these are the things in red, except for the facility use and wedding deposits. If somebody's planning, say, to use the church and they want to send in a deposit, we don't spend it. We actually put it in savings. If for some reason that event doesn't happen, we refund it back. But those other 3 line items are actually come from the general budget. So from income that comes in. The top one is employment taxes. That is state withholdings, which legally we can't spend anyway because it's, like Pam's withholdings that I pay once a year. So it wouldn't be a good idea if we spent those. So this part comes from general fund. It's held in savings. And that's just, you can see it in property taxes and property insurance. That was back on the page 3 report. That just goes right into savings. That's the income going into savings last month.
So Linda, are you saying you robbed Peter to pay Paul?
Not at all.
No.
She's saying she's a good management company, that's what she's saying.
I don't know who's Peter and who's Paul. I might. Maybe I do.
Maybe that's a southern side.
No, I've heard it before, but I just don't.
It's sometimes hard to get the conception of that you escrow it in monthly.
Yeah.
And they think, well, why are you doing that? But
yeah, it's mostly just so I don't have to pay the whole amount in. So our property insurance is due May 5th, and we all know taxes are due. Half of them are in May 31st. So yeah, that would be a huge chunk to come up with. These are dedicated funds, and they also come from the general contributions that or donations that come in, and that's the capital replacement fund. Their balance right now is about $60,000 in the savings account. A certain amount of that, and I don't remember, Ed, is insurance money. We got insurance money for the 14 and 2016 hailstorms, so that can only spend on that. The rest of it is 38,000 is insurance. So the other 20,000 came from the last 15 years of us putting money in there so that they could do things like replace the lights and replace the flooring in the fellowship hall, and the kitchen door. Didn't you have to replace that this year or last year maybe? And then the next thing is the missions. At one point we decided, and this was, I remember David Burt was here, so that would have been in like 2007, a long time ago now. We decided we wanted to just fund try to get to 10%, a tithe of our budget, and give it to missions. So we asked people to only give to the general fund and that we were going to give to missions. Unfortunately, that's another area that can get cut really easily. I mean, you can't really cut the property taxes or the insurance or the utilities, but you can cut that. I believe at one time we had 13,000 going into that annually. Now it's down to 3, but it's better than some churches, I have to tell you that. It's a goal to work for. There again, there's the missions that comes out of the general fund. The rest of the stuff that went in was, it was a larger amount than that, but it was, people still give money every week or every month, and they'll just say undesignated missions. So that all goes into there, and then the missions team decides where that goes. That's where you see the missions. And that's just children's ministries programming. That doesn't show up on a lot of things except page 1 of the treasurer's report. It looks like December $513 came in, and that would have been from the craft and bake sale and the noisy offering. Whoops. And then the rest are dedicated funds, and that makes up the majority of them. And these are all things that were, well, there's memorials, so they're not meant, they didn't come from the general fund. Primarily the rest of them though are from garage sales, or UMYF had car washes and things like that, or just dedicated gifts. One time somebody came in and said, you know, I just love the way the altar looks. I'd love to just give money to worship environment. And so I didn't leave it in checking account because it would have been spent, you know, without checking it. It went in here, and that's what they, and then people gave money for the new Christmas decorations last year. So this is all dedicated funds, but not from general fund income. That's your, and then these are the 2 general ones. The general savings designated, the interest from the savings account goes in there every month, and then it's prorated to all these other accounts in December. And then the next one, and then it's short-term projects like, well, I think Messy Church is in there, which is starting to be a long-term project, but you know, when it first started. So different things like that we just didn't have, haven't made a line for yet. And then here's the general savings undesignated. So that is also extra money that can be spent on anything in the budget. And that and just in savings alone is several months worth. And then the final page is just the a comparison for, I think it runs 8 years. Yeah, 8 years. So you can kind of see what the trends are. And it's kind of interesting just to look at the trends. And this one doesn't have December of this year. I worked on this last weekend at home, and I didn't have my current numbers, so.
You completed 2018 on our copy.
Oh yeah, that's true. So, yeah, if you guys have any questions about this, I'm glad to answer them either tonight, or if they're specific about your committee, it'd probably be better if you just visit with me anytime. And it's a lot of numbers, and I have to confess, I like numbers, and I've been doing this a long time, so it all makes sense to me, but.
And it's a serious offer too, and I would like when we'll sit down with you if you've got a question about how it works.
Certainly.
So don't hesitate to contact.
And we do an audit every year. We do the audit that the Methodist Church recommends, and in order, you bet. Here. One of the things that we have to do is the auditors need to verify that I am paying the bills, and so I have a form that if you have to be reimbursed, or if you have an expense that's coming up, we'd like you to fill out one of these, and they're in the front office or my office, and the committee chair has to sign it. The reason for this is because the committee chair needs to know where he sits or she sits
And
with
that,
their budget.
and that goes back to the approval thing. Like if you have a team working on a project, or a couple of folks working on a project for you,
Yeah.
we need to know that it's an approved expense
Yeah,
for that thing. So.
so that's it.
I need one of those.
Thank you, Linda.
It's great.
Actually, I really do want to get a little bit. This church budget, the way it's structured, there's a lot of churches that don't have that layout, don't know where they stand, don't know how to function. So this is a lot of work, and Linda stays on top of it. So I actually do want to thank you for that.
That's why we have to keep Linda happy.
All right.
Can I hear it? Amen.
Amen.
That means
last year, I asked committees and teams to start thinking about setting goals each year. Not everybody did it, and I'm not going to call out who didn't do it, I promise you. But I would like every group to think about doing that. Church Council has set those goals on your playbook to help you think about what we're focusing on as a church. It's important to consider those in your goals. Here's what I do want to say really quick. The groups that did it have actually met their goals in ways that they didn't realize. So I shared with Ed earlier. The trustees said their goals for this year were 1, to fix roof leaks, 2, to make improvements on the sign by the road, 3, to change as much LED lighting as possible, and they did everything. Deal with the piano issue, but we got the piano, and replace the rug in the fellowship hall. So they did everything on their list. And I don't think that Ed kept this in front of him all the time, but it was really cool for me to look back today and go, you guys did exactly what you were hoping to do last year. So, visitation team had some goals. We're actually looking at some stuff in visitation now. It's going to be helpful to go back to those. And children and youth team, you guys did pretty good too. Let me just say this. Provide a faith-based learning experience for ages 3 to 18 each week. Yearly initiate one outreach activity that results in the involvement of 2 young families. We did exactly that. That's what's funny to me. We have 2 new young families from the work we've done. And create 5 opportunities each year for children to be involved in the life of church, children's choir. You guys did it. So I want to say thank you to those folks who did their goals this year. So you've got this month and next month when you're meeting with your committees, I'd like you to fill out this sheet. I've handed it to you. You can use your sheets from last year. Those of you I've got sheets for, I have the ones from last year. And on those sheets, get a picture of your committee, please, for the website and names of everybody. We'd like to make sure we're recognizing folks who are serving. Make sure you understand as a committee what your primary purpose is. You can look at the book of discipline for those regular committees, things like that. You can also just sit down and name what is the purpose of our group. That's really important, especially when we start to share that with the congregation. I've had a couple conversations in the last couple of weeks with different groups who kind of said, you know, we need to tell the congregation what we do. And if you have a mission statement to be able to just say, this is who we are, what we're about, it really helps describe that. And then set your 3 to 4 goals for next year. Like I said, I encourage you to go look at that playbook, the goals that are set by the congregation. See if there's ways that those line up. See if there's some ways you can collaborate on those in your 3 to 4 goals. But they don't have to, as a reminder as well.
Question.
Yeah.
So, is there any way for people to know, like, if there's room for them to join committees? And do we put that out there to the congregation or no?
So my answer to that is there's always room on almost every committee right now.
Sure.
So if you hear of an interest or a passion from somebody, I think that's a conversation for me and you, or for Dennis and Dave King. It'd be good to just let them know so that we know we're watching for those folks and can have that conversation. But yes, and a reminder that for the teams especially, if you got somebody new, get them in the group, and if you can get them connected, we're a small church, so those committees and teams become community pretty quickly.
Right, I'm just thinking back to when I was new, I had no idea that there were any opportunities to get on anything,
So we're also going to start taking those mission moments before offering, and that's actually, I'm going to start in the next couple of weeks, and have the teams and committees share who they are and how you can get involved too, so, yeah. But we need to do more of it, to be a part of that too. So if you can get me those back by the 20th of February, that's something I'm going to share with Church Council and make a packet of so we know what teams and committees are working on. Part of that also is when we get to budgeting, the budgeting process Linda talked about, it will be nice for us to know your goals so that when we see your budget and if you're trying to shoot for something, that we can, you know, like Linda said, we might fully fund you that year, but we might not be able to fund you the next year. And so we will know you're shooting for certain things.